Welcome to HFY Fiction Journey, where humanity's strength, defiance, and survival are at the heart of every story. Today, we dive into a tale of one human, caught in the delicate balance of fear, power, and something far more dangerous. The heavy, polished doors of Queen Naria's royal chambers stood before Daniel, imposing and unmoving. He had been summoned, though no one explained why. And when the queen summoned, hesitation was not an option. With a trembling hand, Daniel knocked, but no response came. Gathering the courage he had left, he slowly pushed the door open. There, standing in the center of the room, was Queen Naria herself. As the door creaked, she turned slowly, her violet eyes narrowing in displeasure. Her sapphire blue skin shimmered in the low light, and her long, dark hair seemed to absorb the very shadows around her. But what struck Daniel most wasn't her powerful presence. It was her attire. Instead of the regal armor she usually wore during the day, she was draped in a delicate nightgown. For a moment, Daniel forgot to breathe, his heart pounding not out of fear but something far more primal. He had seen her in all her grandeur and control, but never like this, never so vulnerable, so human. The silence in the room grew thick with tension. "You dare?" Queen Naria's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "You dare enter my chambers without permission?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He knew he should bow, kneel, anything to show respect. But something deep inside him rebelled. His mind screamed to submit, but his body refused. Naria's eyes flared with anger as she approached, each step deliberate, predatory. When she stood mere inches away, she tilted her head, studying him as if he were nothing more than an insect beneath her gaze. "I summoned you," she hissed, her voice now a dangerous whisper. "And yet, you make the grave error of entering without permission." "I knocked," Daniel replied, his voice shaky but defiant. "You didn't answer." A slow, cruel smile formed on Naria's lips. "And you thought silence meant you could disobey?" Before he could respond, her hand shot out, grabbing his chin with surprising strength. Her touch was cold, sending a shiver down his spine as she forced him to meet her piercing gaze. "You forget your place, human." She released him, turning away with a flick of her wrist. "Strip," she commanded, her back to him. Daniel's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He knew the queen's punishments could be brutal, but something about her touch had awakened a sense of defiance in him. He wasn't going to submit so easily, not this time. When he hesitated, Naria caught his reflection in one of the holographic displays, her voice now low and dangerous. Gritting his teeth, Daniel pulled off his tunic and tossed it to the floor. His heart thundered in his chest as he stood, shirtless, waiting. Naria turned slowly, her eyes roaming over him with an expression he couldn't read. There was a flicker in her gaze, something that wasn't quite anger, but Daniel couldn't place it. To his surprise, she stepped closer again, her movements slow, deliberate. This time, her hand brushed lightly against his bare chest. Her cool fingers traced the lines of his muscles, sending a shiver through him once more. But now, it wasn't fear that coursed through his veins. It was something much more dangerous. Queen Naria's voice softened as she spoke, though it still carried a tone of authority. "I see now why you defy me. You think yourself above your station." Her violet eyes locked onto Daniel's, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. He could feel the power radiating from her, a dangerous and intoxicating mix of control and allure. She was both a queen and a captor, but standing this close, Daniel could no longer deny the pull between them. Sensing the shift, Queen Naria stepped back, her cold demeanor returning as quickly as it had softened. "You are a fool," she said, though her voice lacked the venom it once had. "A fool who will learn his place." She turned, gliding toward a long, ornate table covered with strange, glowing artifacts. "Tomorrow, you will report to the training grounds for punishment. But tonight," she paused, casting a glance over her shoulder, her eyes lingering on him longer than necessary. "You will stay here, Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing with questions. Before he could speak, Naria continued, "I will decide your fate in the morning. For now, you will learn what it means to serve your queen." With a wave of her hand, she dismissed him. The door clicked shut behind him, but the weight of her gaze lingered long after he had left the room. The cold metallic sound of the door closing echoed in Daniel's mind as he stood shirtless in the corridor, his skin still tingling from her touch. There were no guards to escort him back to the servant quarters, no one waiting to drag him to the punishment cells as he had feared. Instead, the queen had ordered him to remain in her chambers for reasons she had not revealed. As the night wore on, Daniel found it impossible to sleep, tossing and turning on the thin cot in the small, featureless room within her personal wing of the palace. He couldn't stop thinking about her. The lavish bed draped in iridescent silk remained untouched, an offering he wasn't sure he was allowed to accept. He had been thrust into a world beyond his understanding, a prisoner, yet the boundaries of captivity seemed to blur more with each passing day. Why had she spared him from punishment? What was she planning? The flickering lights of the alien city cast shifting shadows across the room. Daniel could see the towering spires and the blue glow of the skyline stretching into the distance. Despite the grandeur, it all felt suffocating, a gilded cage. Just as he began to drift into a restless sleep, the door to his chamber slid open. Daniel sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. In the dim light, the silhouette was unmistakable, Queen Naria. She stepped into the room, her presence filling it instantly. This time, she wore a more formal gown, woven from a deep midnight blue fabric that shimmered with an ethereal glow. "You didn't sleep?" she observed, her voice low and calm, though it carried an edge that made Daniel's skin prickle. "I couldn't," he admitted, swinging his legs over the side of the cot and meeting her gaze as evenly as he could. Naria stepped further into the room, the door sliding shut behind her. Her gaze swept over him, taking in his bare chest. Though her expression remained unreadable, Daniel could feel the weight of her scrutiny. "Do you know why I spared you?" she asked, her tone cool but curious. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I've been trying to figure that out." A slight twitch of amusement crossed Naria's lips, though her expression stayed stern. "You are defiant. It intrigues me. Most humans, when faced with the consequences of their insolence, would grovel for mercy. You, on the other hand, challenge me." Daniel felt a pulse of anger rise within him, but he swallowed it down. He had no intention of challenging her outright, at least not yet. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. Naria began circling him slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "I have ruled this empire for over a century. My people are loyal because they fear me, and I am feared because I do not allow weakness. You," she paused, narrowing her eyes, "you are an anomaly, a human who resists when he should know better. You are not broken." Daniel frowned, unsure where she was going with this. "And that bothers you?" "No," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. "It fascinates me." She stopped in front of him, locking her violet eyes onto his. They stood in silence, the air between them thick with tension. Daniel's pulse quickened, but this time it wasn't just fear coursing through him. There was something else, something electric. "You're toying with me," Daniel said, his voice low but the accusation clear. Naria's eyes flashed dangerously, but instead of lashing out, she leaned in closer. "Am I?" she whispered, her breath cool against his skin. For a moment, Daniel's resolve wavered. He wanted to push her away, to demand an end to whatever twisted game this was, but something kept him rooted in place. The magnetic pull of her presence, the way her gaze pierced through him, making it impossible to think straight. "I could crush you," Naria murmured, her fingers lightly tracing along Daniel's jawline. Her touch was gentle yet possessive. One word, one command, and your life is over. Daniel swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at him to move, speak, or react in any way. But he couldn't. He was trapped, not only by her power, but also by the strange, unspoken connection forming between them. "You think I'm afraid of you," he finally said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm not." Naria's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "No, you're not afraid, but you should be." She pulled away, the cold mask of authority slipping back into place. Her gaze hardened once more. "You will continue to serve me," she commanded, her tone sharp and commanding. "But your duties will change. You will remain by my side, under my watchful eye. And in return," her voice softened, almost imperceptibly, "I will allow you to live." Daniel's mind reeled. What kind of offer was this? A shift in duties? Staying by her side? What exactly was she asking of him? "And if I refuse," he asked, though he already knew the answer. Naria's smile widened, cold and predatory. "You won't." She turned and strode toward the door, her gown trailing behind her like a shadow. Just as she reached the threshold, she paused and glanced back at him. "You may think you're free, Daniel, but remember, you belong to me." The door slid shut with a soft click, leaving Daniel alone in the dim room once again, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He sat in silence, his mind racing with the implications of her demand. Stay by her side, serve her in a new capacity. The Queen was playing a dangerous game, and whether he liked it or not, he was now part of it. But there was something else, something unspoken lurking beneath her cold, imperious exterior, something that both terrified and intrigued him. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Naria's face, those violet eyes burning into his soul, that predatory smile as she told him he belonged to her. Suddenly, the door to his chamber slid open, startling him from his thoughts. Standing in the doorway was one of Naria's elite guards, a tall figure clad in shimmering blue armor. Without a word, the guard motioned for Daniel to follow. He didn't need to ask where they were going. The answer was clear. Once again, he was being summoned. The guard stopped in front of the large, ornate doors to Naria's private quarters. Without speaking, the guard stepped aside, leaving Daniel alone before the doors. He took a deep breath and knocked. "Enter," came her voice from within, soft but commanding, the sound enough to make his pulse quicken. The door slid open, and Daniel stepped inside. At the far end of the room stood Queen Naria. She was dressed in a sheer, flowing gown, the deep midnight blue fabric clinging to her form and accentuating every curve of her body. Her long, dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, the soft strands reflecting the pale light. There was something different about her tonight, something softer, yet more dangerous. Her violet eyes met his as he entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension, an electric current vibrating through the room. "You came quickly," she said, her voice smooth and almost teasing as she walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "I didn't think I had much of a choice," Daniel replied, though his voice lacked its usual edge. Something in her gaze made it hard to stay defiant. Naria smiled faintly, but there was something deeper in her expression than amusement. "You always think you have no choice," she murmured, stepping closer until she was just inches from him, her presence overwhelming his senses. "But you do." Daniel's breath hitched as she reached up, her cool hand resting on his chest, her fingers brushing lightly over his skin. Her touch made his mind go blank for a moment, the tension between them humming like a live wire. "Naria," he began, unsure of what he was even trying to say. "I called you here for a reason," she said softly, her voice dropping to a near whisper as her fingers traced the lines of his chest, sending a shiver down his spine. "You know what that reason is, don't you?" Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "I think so." Naria's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "Good. Then you understand the stakes." She stepped even closer, her body almost brushing against his. Daniel could feel the coolness of her skin radiating through the thin fabric of her gown, the intoxicating scent of her alien perfume filling the air. The scent surrounding Naria was unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced, sharp, sweet, and utterly consuming. His breath quickened, his pulse racing. His mind screamed at him to step back, to remember she was still his captor, the queen who held his life in her hands. But his body was drawn to her, pulled into the gravity of her presence. "I don't understand what you want from me," Daniel said, his voice hoarse, his resolve slipping as her hand trailed up to his shoulder. The weight of her touch grounded him, even as it stirred something deep inside. Naria's smile softened, and for the first time, she seemed less like a queen and more like a woman, conflicted, powerful, and dangerous all at once. "I want you to see me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not as your queen, not as your captor, but as a woman who has been alone for too long." Without warning, she closed the distance between them, her lips brushing his with sudden intensity. The kiss ignited the tension that had been building between them for so long. It was soft at first, hesitant, as though she was testing the waters. But as Daniel responded, her kiss deepened, her fingers tightening around his shoulder, pulling him closer. Daniel's mind spun, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and desire. This was madness, absolute madness. But he couldn't pull away. The feel of her lips, the coolness of her skin beneath his fingers, the taste of her, it consumed him, drowning out every rational thought. When Naria broke the kiss, her breathing was unsteady, her eyes dark with need as she gazed up at him. "Do you want this?" she asked, her voice a mixture of command and vulnerability. "Do you want me?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling from the weight of her question. He knew the consequences, the danger, but in that moment, staring into her eyes, feeling the heat of her body resting against his, none of it mattered. "Yes," he whispered, the word escaping his lips before he could stop it. A slow, satisfied smile spread across Naria's face as she cupped his face in her hands, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Then tonight, you are mine." The rest of the night passed in a blur of heated touches, whispered words, and the overwhelming intensity of their connection. Naria was both commanding and tender, her control never fully relinquished, but tempered by a desire she had clearly struggled to suppress. Daniel found himself lost in the moment, the lines between captive and queen dissolving as they gave in to the undeniable pull between them. The room was filled with the sound of their ragged breaths, the soft rustle of fabric, and the quiet hum of the alien city outside. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the weight of their emotions more powerful than words could express. Naria lay beside him, her body still pressed against his, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment, she seemed at peace, vulnerable in a way Daniel had never seen before. But he knew this peace was fragile. The tension between them, though momentarily eased, was far from over. As Daniel began to drift off to sleep, one thought lingered in his mind. What happens now? The next morning, Daniel stirred in a luxurious bed, the events of the previous night vivid in his mind. Naria, sensing his unease, stirred beside him, her violet eyes blinking open. For a moment, she looked at him without the cool, calculating gaze of a ruler, just a woman, unsure of what came next. "You need to leave before anyone sees," she said softly, her voice still thick with sleep but laced with urgency. Daniel nodded, his throat tight as he rose from the bed and gathered his clothes. As he dressed, Naria watched him, her expression unreadable, a mixture of longing and concern etched into her regal features. "Last night," she began, but her voice trailed off as she sat up, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. "It cannot happen again." Daniel paused, pulling his shirt over his head. He had expected this. "Because of your people," he asked quietly. "Because of the court," Naria corrected, her tone sharpening. "If they find out, it will be seen as a betrayal. They already whisper about my leadership, about my judgment. A queen cannot afford to show weakness. Is that what you think this is? Weakness?" Daniel asked, meeting her gaze. Naria hesitated, her eyes flickering with conflict. "No," she admitted softly. But they will. Daniel finished dressing in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. I'll go, he said finally, turning toward the door. Daniel. Naria's voice stopped him. When he turned back to face her, her expression had softened again. Be careful. The palace is not as safe as it seems. He nodded, his mind already racing with the implications of her warning. As he left her chambers and slipped into the corridor, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, someone who now knew far too much. Outside the Queen's chambers, hidden in the shadows, stood one of Naria's elite guards, the same guard who had escorted Daniel earlier. On the surface, he was a loyal sentinel, but his sharp ears had picked up every sound from the room behind the door. What he had heard confirmed the suspicions already swirling among the Queen's enemies. He stepped back into the shadows, his mind racing. He needed to act quickly. The Queen's relationship with the human was a dangerous secret, one that could be used to destroy her. The guard turned and hurried down the corridors, his destination clear. There were those in the court who had been waiting for an opportunity like this, a reason to dethrone Queen Naria. And now, he had the perfect weapon to hand them. What news? Asked Carrick, one of the most powerful figures in the court. His blue skin was darker than the others, his eyes cold and calculating. The Queen, the guard began, his voice steady. She's been compromised. The human, he is more than just a servant to her. A brief, stunned silence followed before murmurs spread through the group. Are you certain? Carrick pressed, his voice low and dangerous. I overheard them in her chambers, the guard confirmed, his gaze unwavering. It's clear she has developed feelings for him. She's hiding it, but there's no doubt about what I heard. The tension in the room thickened as Carrick exchanged glances with the other conspirators. This is the weakness we've been waiting for, he said, his voice dripping with venom. A queen who fraternizes with a slave, an earthling no less, is unfit to rule. Another noble leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. This could be the perfect opportunity to remove her once and for all. Carrick smiled, slow and cruel. Indeed, but we must be careful. If we move too soon, we risk exposing ourselves. The people still respect her authority, flawed though it may be. We need to strike in a way that leaves no doubt about her unworthiness. And how do you propose we do that? The guard asked, his voice low. Carrick's smile widened. We use the human. The guard frowned. How? Carrick's eyes gleamed with dark intent. We offer him something he can't refuse, his freedom. He wants to return Earth, doesn't he? We promise him a way home, an escape from this prison. All he has to do is eliminate the Queen. A stunned silence filled the room before one of the conspirators spoke up. You mean poison hers? Carrick nodded. Yes, something subtle, something difficult to trace. Once she's gone, we'll claim her death was an accident. No one will question the stability of the Empire if she simply fades away. The guard hesitated. And the human? What happens to him once he's served his purpose? Carrick's voice was cold and calculating. We send him back to his primitive planet. He'll have no idea he was just a pawn in our game. With the Queen gone, Carrick continued, order would be restored to the Empire. A murmur of agreement passed through the group. Find a human, Carrick ordered the guard. Make the offer. He won't refuse. The guard nodded, bowing deeply before turning to leave. The plan was in motion. Soon, Queen Naria's reign would come to a swift and silent end, and the human would be the one to deliver the fatal blow. Later that day, Daniel found himself walking through one of the palace's marble corridors when the same guard approached him. His face was unreadable. Come with me, the guard said, his tone flat but urgent. There's something you need to know. Unease curled in Daniel's gut as he followed the guard, his mind still replaying his encounter with Naria. Something about the guard's demeanor put him on edge, but curiosity and dread pushed him forward. They stopped in an empty room, and the guard turned to face him, his expression serious. There are those within the palace who know about you and the Queen, the guard began, his voice low. They planned to act against her, to remove her from power. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, dread settling over him. What does that have to do with me? They're offering you a way out, the guard continued, his eyes narrowing. They know you want to return to Earth. They're willing to send you back. But you must do something for them first. Daniel's blood ran cold. What do they want me to do? The guard's gaze hardened. Poison her. Kill the queen, and you'll be free. Daniel sat alone in the dimly lit room, the conspirators' offer weighing heavily on his mind. His thoughts raced, his heart conflicted. They had promised him everything he wanted. Freedom, a chance to return to Earth. But the cost was unimaginable. Queen Naria's life. A knock at the door startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. Before he could respond, the door slid open, and Queen Naria stepped inside. Even in the low light, her presence was commanding. She wore a simple gown, soft and flowing, the deep blue fabric shimmering faintly in the glow of the alien city outside. But it wasn't her regal bearing that caught Daniel's attention. It was a look in her eyes, desire, longing, and something else, something far more vulnerable. "Naria," Daniel began, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Naria silenced him with a look. Without a word, she crossed the room with graceful, fluid movements, her gaze never leaving his. As she reached him, she placed a cool hand on his chest, sending a shiver down his spine. "I couldn't stay away," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with intensity. "I thought I could control what's between us, but I was wrong." Daniel's heart raced as she leaned in, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that started gentle and tentative, but quickly deepened with the heat of their unspoken desires. He kissed her back, his hands sliding around her waist, pulling her closer. For a moment, the weight of the world disappeared. There was only her, the feel of her body against his, the taste of her lips. Their connection was undeniable, the tension that had simmered between them finally boiling over into raw intimacy. They moved together, their hands exploring each other with a mix of tenderness and urgency. Naria's breath was warm against his skin as she whispered his name, her voice filled with a longing that matched his own. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and flushed, Daniel saw vulnerability in her eyes. "Naria," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you." Her expression shifted, concern flickering across her features. "What is it?" Daniel took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "The conspirators, they came to me. They offered me a way back to Earth. But only if I poisoned you." Naria's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And what did you say?" "I haven't given them an answer," Daniel admitted. "But I came here to tell you. I couldn't keep it from you." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick between them. Then, to Daniel's surprise, Naria smiled slowly, a glint of something dangerous in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, brushing a hand against his cheek. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Before Daniel could respond, Naria's expression hardened slightly, her eyes narrowing as she made a decision. "I need your help, Daniel. There's something you must do." "What is it?" he asked, his mind still spinning from the revelation he had just shared. "You will tell them that you've accepted their offer," Naria said, her voice firm but not cold. "You will pretend to poison me. In doing so, you'll help me uncover every traitor in my court. Once we know who they are, they'll be dealt with permanently." Daniel hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. "You want me to trick them?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "If you do this, not only will you help me save my empire, but you will also be free to stay, to live here without the chains of servitude. You'll be my chief advisor, someone I can trust completely. And if I want to return to Earth," Daniel asked cautiously. Naria's gaze softened. "If you wish to leave, I'll arrange it. You've earned that much." She paused, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "But I hope you'll stay." Daniel searched her eyes for any hint of deception, but all he saw was sincerity. She was offering him everything: freedom, power, and most importantly, her trust. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice resolute. "I'll help you." Naria smiled, a genuine and grateful smile. For the first time, Daniel felt like he was more than just her servant. He was her partner in this dangerous game, someone she could rely on. The next few days passed in a tense blur. Daniel met with the conspirators, his heart pounding as he delivered the news they had been waiting for. "I'll do it," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "I'll poison her." The conspirators exchanged dark smiles, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. On the night of the planned assassination, Daniel followed through with the plan, slipping a harmless substance into the Queen's drink under the watchful eyes of the conspirators. Naria, ever the master strategist, feigned illness perfectly, collapsing just as they had hoped, giving the appearance that their plot had succeeded. Within hours, Naria's guards rounded up every traitor in the court, dragging them down to the palace dungeons where they would remain for the rest of their lives. Carrick and his fellow conspirators never saw it coming. The Queen had won. That night, Naria stood in her private chambers, gazing out at the alien skyline with Daniel by her side. The air between them crackled with unspoken emotion, the weight of everything they had been through still fresh in their minds. "You've saved my empire," Naria said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "And for that, I am forever grateful." "I didn't do it for the empire," Daniel said softly, his eyes lingering on her. "I did it for you." Naria turned to face him, her expression softening. "And I thank you for that more than you know." She stepped closer, reaching out to cup his face gently. "You've earned your freedom, Daniel. You can go back to Earth if you wish. But if you choose to stay, you'll be by my side. Not as my servant, but as my equal, my advisor." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He had come to this alien world as a captive, a mere pawn in a larger game. But now, he stood before the Queen as something more, someone she trusted, someone she desired. "I'll stay," he said finally, his voice filled with certainty. Naria smiled, a slow, sensual smile that made his pulse quicken. "Good," she whispered, stepping even closer until their bodies were inches apart. "Because there is still so much I wish to share with you." She leaned in, her lips brushing as in a kiss that was both tender and filled with unspoken promises. The night stretched on, their connection deepening as they spent the evening together in each other's arms. It was a moment of shared intimacy, trust, and passion, a bond forged through fire and danger. By the time the morning sun rose, Daniel knew that his place was here, with her, no longer a prisoner, but a man with purpose, a man who had found something worth staying for. And as the new chief advisor to the Queen, his future was brighter than he could have ever imagined.